hear there's a little bit of feedback from the mic. Is it? You may not be hearing it. So, in the story that I just read, it's been 3 years since Elijah warned Ahab about the drought. Can you remember back a few weeks? Elijah the prophet told Ahab the king that no moisture at all, not even dew, was going to fall from the sky until he, Elijah, commanded that it happen. Well, 3 very long, dry years later, God said, "Enough is enough, Elijah. Go tell Ahab it's going to rain." So Elijah went. But before he got to the king, he met a man traveling up the road, a man named Obadiah. And Obadiah is, he's what we call the chief steward of the king's palace. It was a very prestigious position. He was Ahab's right-hand man, his most trusted official. And yet, Obadiah is keeping a very big secret from the king. See, Ahab was married to the notorious Queen Jezebel. And Jezebel was a faithful follower of Lord Baal, that storm god that we've been hearing so much about lately. As I explained to you before, these stories about Elijah play out for me kind of like a cosmic boxing match between the Lord Baal and the great God of Israel. And in this fight, in the gigantic boxing ring where that would take place, Jezebel is like, she's like the manager of Baal, and she is his biggest fan. It was through her efforts that the worship of Baal became so very popular among the people of Israel. She coaxed her husband, the king, to worship her God. And then he, the king, encouraged his people, Israel, to do the same thing. 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 30 reports that Ahab did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any other king of Israel to come before him. And the text tells us that that was in great part due to his wicked wife. Jezebel did all she could to remove God from the hearts and from the mind of Israel. And along that line, she ordered the death of God's prophets throughout all over the country. But Obadiah, this king's steward, right, his most trusted official, Obadiah went behind the king's back to intervene as much as he possibly could. He hid these prophets, 100 of God's prophets, and he kept them safe. He protected them and fed them. So for the 3 years that Elijah was hiding in Zarephath with that widow eating her bread, Obadiah was hiding the prophets of God from Jezebel and sharing his bread with them. And then after all of that time, after all of that stress, Obadiah meets Elijah right there in the middle of the road. And the prophet has the gall, I think, to order Obadiah, "Go tell the king that Elijah is here." Well, that request frightened Obadiah. It frightened him a great deal. King Ahab had been looking for Elijah all over everywhere because it was Elijah's warning that started this horrible drought. And the drought wasn't going to come to an end until Elijah spoke the command for it to end. So naturally, as the king is watching his world dry Ahab searched high and low for Elijah. And by oath of blood, by oath of death, people swore that they couldn't find him anywhere. He was nowhere to be found. And then suddenly he was found. And he was standing in front of Obadiah saying, "Go tell your king that I'm not nowhere, I am here." But there was a problem, you see, because Elijah had a reputation of just disappearing. People said that God could transport him wherever God wanted to take him, whenever God wanted to take him there. So what if Obadiah ran to King Ahab and said, "Elijah is here," and then God whisked him away without a trace? As in all of these Elijah narratives that we've been reading, there is a lot going on in this passage. But as I read it over and over again, the thing that spoke to me the most, at least in our present circumstance, the thing that spoke to me the most is Obadiah's plea that God won't forsake him. Did you hear that mingled into his monologue? Let me pull it out for you. He said, "What have I done wrong that you are handing your servant over to Ahab to be put to death? I, your servant, have worshipped the Lord since my youth. Haven't you heard what I did while Jezebel was killing the prophets of the Lord? I hid 100 of those prophets and supplied them with food and with water." If Elijah disappears, Obadiah is dead. But it's not just Elijah's absence that he's worried about. He is also worried, maybe even more worried about the absence of God in this situation. So as he rails at Elijah, he pleads with God to protect him, to spare his life, to keep him safe, just like he kept God's prophets safe. Obadiah wants to know that both Elijah and God will stay where he has found them. I think there is a subconscious, or maybe even sometimes a very conscious concern in all of us that God might perhaps abandon us, that God's presence might be transported beyond our finding, that the Lord might disappear and leave us when we aren't looking. Just like Obadiah, we want to know that God will always be present to us. We want to know that wherever we find God, there God will stay. When I was a little girl, I frequently asked my daddy to sleep with me. I asked my parents, both of them, to sleep with me. But my dad never said no, so I asked him more often. He was always very kind and loving to placate my request. But my ornery dad had this sly trick that he used to pull. Once I was asleep, he would get up and sneak away to his own bed. Of course, as an adult, I learned that this is a universal trick shared by all parents who have to lay down with their kids to get them to sleep, right? Been there, done that? Yeah. But as a child, I didn't want Daddy to get away from me. So I devised my own little trick. Before I went to sleep, I would wrap my fingers up in his t-shirt so tightly that he couldn't escape without my knowing it. Child's got to do what a child's got to do. Most of us, and I'm hoping all of us, experience those occasions when we know for a fact that God is as close as our breath. You know, those times when everything is right in our world. We feel abundantly blessed. We feel empowered by the strength of the Lord. And we see evidence that God is most definitely with us and for us. And those moments are times that we feel like we could actually throw out our arms and literally embrace God in a physical embrace, because the Almighty is just that close. And I don't know about you, but I want to hold on to times like that. It reminds me of those perfect days that I've spent with my children, and I don't want them to end. So I often say to them, don't go. Stay. Stay here with me. And I have whispered that same prayer to God when life is filled with bliss and with blessing. Stay, God. Right? Stay here with me. But Obadiah's request was much more desperate because his circumstance was so dire. He wanted Elijah's assurance that neither he nor God would abandon him. And beloved, I have also faced situations when I was afraid that God might abandon me. And if that happened, then I would just lose myself altogether. If not my life, then most certainly my sanity. And in those frantic moments, I anxiously wanted to twist my fingers up in the garments of God so that the Lord couldn't slip away from me without my knowing it. Jesus must have instinctively known that his disciples would be frightened and alone after his death. He knew that they would be dependent on God's nearness to them, on God's abiding presence with them. So he promised his disciples before he was arrested, I won't leave you orphaned. I will come to you. My Father and I will come to you, and we will abide with you. We will make our home with you. Remain in me, and I will remain in you. And in Matthew's Gospel, as Christ ascends into heaven, we hear God's voice speaking through him to those first Christians. I am with you always, even to the end of the age. We have this assurance, church. We have this assurance that the presence of God remains with us, regardless of our circumstance. Paul so beautifully writes in Romans chapter 8 that nothing will ever be able to separate us from God's love through Jesus Christ. We'll never be left alone to face anything that we might face in the world. The presence of God is a constant, loving spirit, our refuge and our strength, Psalm 46 says, an ever-present help in times of trouble. So I can hear Elijah's words to Obadiah as God's words to Obadiah, spoken right into his heart. He said, as the Lord Almighty lives, I will surely present myself to Ahab today. And if the prophet was present to the king, then God would be present to Obadiah, the Lord's faithful servant. Both Elijah and God would stay where Obadiah found them. And God stays with us as well in times of great joy and equally in times of great suffering and tribulation. God remains by our side and in front of us and behind us, all around us, at all times and in all places. Through the teachings of Jesus, we know, and through his life, from his very death on the cross, from the empty tomb, God has promised to stay and to always stay with us and among us and within us. As the Lord Almighty lives, God is surely present and will present God's self to us today and forever